Imagine for the moment that the Templin Institute has completed its mission, and we now have an exhaustive catalog of every nation, faction, and organization from across every alternate world. And we're no longer investigating them, but placing them into categories. Each civilization bears their own eccentricities and unique qualities, but we can at least begin to classify them along broad lines. We have the Federation builders, who seek to unite their disparate elements to achieve a common good. The hegemonic imperialists, who work tirelessly to impose their own brand of order upon its citizenry, and then the plucky rebellion fighting to overthrow them. Then there's the loose coalition of renegades and independents, or the unknowable hive mind whose legions act in singular purpose, slaving despots, erudite explorers, xenophobic isolationists. However you might choose to label these categories, it's clear that different civilizations can share similar attributes and might be grouped together. So if we imagine that all these categories are all filled out, there might come the temptation to compare them against one another. It's difficult to gauge what kind of civilizations are the most successful or have the greatest potential. All things being equal, will Federation builders always triumph over hegemonic imperialists? Will evangelizing zealots reliably conquer harmonious collectivists? Who can say? There are far too many variables to make any kind of firm proclamation. But I think we can go out on a limb and make a very strong argument that one category, one kind of civilization, is ultimately and perhaps tragically doomed to fail. What we're gonna call the proud warrior race. Chances are, based on the name alone, you can think of at least one nation or faction that fits this category. But before going any further, it's still important to define exactly what we mean by this term. There's no single definition, of course, but the Templin Institute's classification of a proud warrior race would be based on these central tenets or elements. Immense value placed on the mastery of combat techniques. The life of an individual warrior is dedicated almost solely to their craft. A strong but strict code of honor, outlining the norms, rules, and responsibilities of the individual, usually as related to warfare. A decentralized governmental structure in which rival familial clans or some kind of tribal structure competes with or supersedes any national identity. A disproportionate devotion or reverence towards war at the societal level that comes at the expense of economic, industrial, scientific, cultural, or another expression of state power. Now, this definition doesn't perfectly fit every civilization that might be named a proud warrior race. There will always be exceptions. Nor does every warrior race have these elements in equal amounts, but for our purposes, it should be close enough. So what is it then about civilizations that embody these qualities that make them doomed to fail? Well, I think it comes down to a relatively simple answer. These four central tenets of the proud warrior race become increasingly inefficient and counterproductive as technology and society advances. And that's a key part. The proud warrior race can easily be successful during what we might call the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, or maybe even a later era. It might even be uniquely suited to thrive in these ages. But eventually, technological progress will reach a tipping point. These central tenets become obsolete, and what before might have been a major advantage now becomes a glaring weakness. So let's look at these one by one. Immense value placed on the mastery of combat techniques. The life of a warrior is dedicated almost solely to their craft. In any era where the most powerful weapons are swords and bows and everything in between, this makes a lot of sense. These weapons, and others like them, require a great deal of skill to wield efficiently. A force of trained warriors who have spent decades practicing the intricacies of martial combat are probably going to cut right through even a far larger army of untrained conscripts. But sooner or later, somebody is going to invent a new kind of weapon, one that can be deadly even in the hands of a novice.
Yeah. All right, you primitive screwheads, listen up. See this? This is my boomstick!
In most cases, you would expect this to be some kind of firearm, and its invention starts the first ticking clock for the warrior race. It might take a while for this weapon to be refined and be made available in large enough numbers, but once it reaches a tipping point and becomes the new standard, the nature of warfare changes. Practice and training are still important, but devoting your life to mastering the art of personal combat starts leading to diminishing returns. A master warrior who has devoted their entire life to the study of combat is suddenly just as vulnerable to being killed by a bullet as any novice conscript. Except the death of that master warrior now hits far harder, because it represents the loss of decades of investment in time, money, and experience. While that conscript, by contrast, was comparatively cheap to arm and train, his loss is no big deal. And it's only going to get worse and worse for the proud warrior race. As civilization continues to advance, warfare becomes more and more mechanized and sophisticated. The influence of the individual soldier on the course of any major conflict, that human element, if you pardon the expression, starts to get stripped away. Artillery, tanks, aircraft, drones, walkers, interstellar starships, all these things and hundreds of other elements are just more nails in the coffin of a master warrior. That's because none of them require that an entire life be dedicated to their mastery. By contrast, the easier they are for an untrained person to learn, the better. So let's move on to our second element. A strong but strict code of honor outlining the norms, rules, and responsibilities of the individual, usually as related to warfare. Now, in every conflict, there will invariably arise a moment in which a decision must be made between taking an action that has the potential to shorten the conflict and upholding certain moral principles. And it should be stressed that when those moral principles are based around reducing needless cruelty or destruction, this is not a bad thing. Intentionally killing civilians and prisoners of war, torture, hostage-taking, misusing a flag of truce, these are all things that should not be acceptable, even on a battlefield during a time of war. But all too often, the strict code of honor of the proud warrior race has more to do with personal glory and honor than it does with limiting carnage. Weapons and tactics might be deliberately discarded, not because they cause unnecessary suffering, but because according to whatever code, they would damage the honor of whoever is using them.
The Unsullied had slipped past the Kull's army in the night while the Dothraki feasted. Khal Temu had many times their number and could easily have flanked the small force. But to the Dothraki, men on foot are fit only to be ridden down. 18 times the Horse Lords charged, and 18 times the Unsullied locked their shields, lowered their spears, and held the line against 20,000 Dothraki screamers.
This can be admirable, but while codes of honor might attempt to bring some kind of fairness or sense of responsibility to a conflict, they also have the potential to needlessly prolong it, wasting even more lives and resources.
I am a Jem'Hadar. He is a Vorta. It is the order of things. Do you really want to give up your life for the order of things? It is not my life to give up, Captain. And it never was.
And what happens if whoever the proud warrior race is fighting doesn't share that same moral code? Well, as the old saying goes, stand in the ashes of a trillion dead souls and ask the ghosts if honor matters. The silence is your answer. As gruesome as it is to say, having a flexible sense of morality is often useful in warfare, and sometimes necessary in hastening its end. Was eradicating the Formic race necessary for the survival of Earth? I don't know, but I want the discussions deciding that question to be based on rational thinking rather than some ancient code of honor. A strict code of honor, especially one based around personal glory, represents a possible weakness that just isn't present in most other societies.
All right, warriors. Too narrow-minded, no subtlety. And worse, they fight for hopeless causes. Honor. Honor's killed millions of people, hasn't saved a single one.
Alright, so now on to our third tenet. A decentralized governmental structure in which rival familial clans or tribal structures competes with or supersedes any national identity. For whatever reason, the proud warrior race is often divided into great houses, clans, tribes, kindreds, or whatever else. These groups act like states within a state, with their own governments, militaries, and economies. Rivalries and civil wars between them are often a fundamental aspect of how political control over the greater nation is maintained or reformed. In some cases, this is a near perfect representation of feudalism, while in others it's been refined into something else. In the worst cases, only by killing the current ruler can a new one take their place. The proud warrior race is not the only kind of society to have this element present, but when combined with their other defining aspects, it aggravates even further the existing issues within this kind of civilization. So what are these issues? Whether in wartime or peace, the potential of any civilization is going to be closely linked to its internal unity. A coherent national identity that can create solidarity across even diverse groups, a strong political order that can accommodate or suppress internal divisions, and a belief in the legitimacy of state institutions are all effective tools a nation can rely on. But when powerful families are competing with a national government, these tools can't be used to their full effect, because they're inherently dangerous to these different tribes, clans, or houses. The weaker the national government, the stronger these different groups. And if a nation is in the middle of being invaded, it would be disastrous for their armed forces to be split between a number of rival groups, each with their own doctrines, strategies, and equipment. If some of these groups have rivalries with each other and maybe even refuse to work alongside one another, then the problems get even worse. It's even possible that some of these clans or houses might be willing to work with the enemy if they think their standing might be improved by the defeat of the central government. This is not how a stable nation functions. This brings us to our last tenet. A disproportionate devotion or reverence towards war at the societal level that comes at the expense of economic, industrial, scientific, cultural, or another expression of state power. For this one, we need to look at the concept of total war. This is a kind of warfare first discussed in the 18th century, but was really solidified as a concept during the two world wars. And the timing, I don't think, was any accident. By the 20th century, the methods by which a war might be fought had grown so all-encompassing that basically nothing was excluded. Every resource, every piece of infrastructure, every person had become a tool necessary to the war effort. This was the new standard by which large-scale conflicts would be fought, because anything less than a total war would be disastrous for the side that couldn't fully commit. But ironically, most examples of the proud warrior race are less suited to fighting a total war because of their rigid consideration of what does and doesn't contribute to the war effort. They only consider the obvious.
Medical research isn't a priority for the High Council. I am forced to obtain information however I can.
That doesn't sound very honorable.
Given the choice between honor and saving lives, I choose the latter.
Perhaps you should ask your superiors to steal a genome sequencer, We're not going to be able to map the virus without the proper technology.
To them, only the jobs directly involved with fighting on the front line are honorable and worth investing in. This is a narrow view incompatible with total war. Industrial workers, economists, scientists, engineers, these are all professions with limited direct involvement in battles and campaigns, but that all nevertheless contribute enormously when mobilized under the doctrine of total war. And those careers are just the start of a very long list. Just as an example, let's pull a job out of a hat and look at meteorologists. I think most proud warrior races would say that studying the weather is no fit job for a warrior.
Still today, though, significant rainfall on the way, and for our area. So oh my gosh, that was creepy. Oh, of course he had to be right on my head. Oh, I just don't like that. Okay, I gotta move it.
And yet, right around the Second World War, military meteorology drastically grew in importance. Turns out, if you're sailing 100,000 men across the English Channel, it's very helpful to know ahead of time when the seas are going to be calm and the skies clear. Or at least calm and clear enough. Let's pull another job out of the hat. Italian chef.
Do you know, if it had, like, ham in it, it's closer. No. It's closer to a British carbonara. Do you agree?
Yeah.
But you know what I mean?
If my grandmother had wheels, she would have been a bike. You know what? It doesn't make any sense what you said. It's a different recipe.
Again, the proud warrior race would say making ravioli is no fit job for a warrior. But again, right on schedule, during World War II, it became increasingly critical to keep large armies fed, no matter where they were in the world. And that's how Ettore Boiardi, or Chef Boyardee, gets awarded the Order of Lenin for his contributions in supplying rations to the Red Army.
The whole picture is summed up in the sentence, food fights for freedom, and it does. Just as surely and just as effectively as the most dauntless division of American soldiers. It's the weapon that's in our hands here at home, and we can use it to mow down our enemies just as surely as though it were a machine gun, and it's easy.
Now, admittedly, these are just some fun, random examples, but I include them to support my greater point. Wars are not only won on the battlefield, but across the entire nation that's fighting them. And in an era in which technology is evolving so quickly, it's not always obvious what elements of society will be key to a military victory. By ignoring certain facets of their own civilization in favor of those elements that are obviously related to the military, they are weakening their ability to win a war, not strengthening it. But you know what? You don't have to take my word for it. Let's look at some examples of the proud warrior race and see how these central tenets of their civilization have contributed to their decline. And I think we have three very good case studies: the Klingon Empire, the Krogan, and the Mandalorians. These are all civilizations that, while successful during earlier periods of their history, now struggle as an interstellar power. For most people, the Klingon Empire is going to be the essential archetype for the proud warrior race, and with good reason. Their civilization expresses all four of our central tenets to an almost cartoonish extent. But the Templin Institute has discussed the decline of the Klingon Empire before, so in this case, I'd like to focus on their great houses and how they represent such a huge weakness in the integrity of the Klingon state. By the 24th century, the Klingon Empire had begun to run out of places to expand. Their major neighbors were equally powerful and capable states, and there was no guarantee of any easy victory in any potential war. In fact, it was far more likely that a major conflict would be just as damaging to the Klingons as it would be to their opponents. For the proud warrior race, this is a major problem. When your entire culture is focused on warfare, but warfare is no longer good for your culture, what do? If you are one of the great houses of the Klingon Empire, a powerful family with their associated armies and fleets, your answer is you begin to turn on each other. And this isn't even unusual. Not since the time of Kalis have all the houses been truly united. But without a common enemy to periodically unite them, the Empire starts to fracture. And because of this, there is no civilization in the Alpha or Beta quadrants of the galaxy so easy to destabilize as the Klingon Empire. All the Romulans need to do, for example, is begin secretly funding a house who doesn't like the reigning government, and in a very short order, you have all the conditions necessary for a civil war. Whereas the Romulans, and pretty much every other government rivaling the Klingons, are entirely immune to the same kind of destabilization being effective against them. Compared to the Klingons, the Romulan government is robust, centralized, and most importantly, the Romulan people consider themselves to be imperial citizens first, and members of whatever family or subgroup they might belong to a distant second. Any aspect of the Romulan Star Empire hostile to its own government is likely a weak fringe group, and even the assistance and aid of the Klingons won't change that. Even a state like the Federation, with thousands of different powerful peoples and groups within it, can't be manipulated in the same way. Partially because Starfleet maintains a sizable monopoly on the use of force, but mainly because every group in the Federation benefits when they work together. A useful discovery on Vulcan isn't greedily reserved for their use alone, but instead distributed across the entire Federation. The Klingon Great Houses, however, have no such incentive. Individually, they can only benefit at the expense of their rivals. So what then about the Krogan? Well, to me, the Krogan represent the natural end state for any proud warrior race that fails to evolve into something else. When discussing that first tenet, we talked about how the invention of firearms is the kind of development that can really shatter the traditional notions of what it means to be a trained warrior. So what happens then when a culture obsessed with warfare invents nuclear bombs? Well, probably something like this. When a civilization possesses weapons capable of destroying itself, it's often described as walking a tightrope, stretched across some never-ending abyss. For that civilization to save its people from a nuclear holocaust or whatever else, they just can't use these weapons. They have to keep walking the tightrope no matter how difficult it might be. The alternative is extinction. In our own world, mankind has been walking the nuclear tightrope for about 80 years, and has been mostly successful so far. And any success has been possible because we have countless examples of world leaders throughout history warning the public on the dangers of possessing these weapons. I particularly like this quote from John F. Kennedy.
World order will be secured only when the whole world has laid down these weapons which seem to offer us present security but threaten our future survival of the human race. That armistice day seems very far away. The vast resources of this planet are being devoted more and more to the means of destroying instead of enriching human life. But the world was not meant to be a prison in which man awaits his executioner, nor has mankind survived the tests and the trials of thousands of years to surrender everything, including its existence.
Now, can you imagine any Krogan or any other member of a proud warrior race expressing these sentiments? It's completely inimical to their way of life. Weapons to them are meant to be used, and if a Krogan did try to express these sentiments, it clearly didn't work. Their homeworld became exactly what JFK described, a prison on which the Krogan awaited their execution. It was only through the actions of the Citadel Council that they eventually became a spacefaring civilization. Most other examples of the proud warrior race, I'd imagine, won't be so lucky, and I'm willing to bet that 9 out of 10 will end up as nothing more than a pile of bones in an irradiated ruin. Now for our final example, the Mandalorians. At first glance, they might appear better suited to avoiding the pitfalls of the proud warrior race. The whole idea of the Mandalore seems to have really come into its own after the development of blasters, not before, so they're better able to integrate these weapons into their society. There was a strong national government that had mostly constrained the power of the individual clans, and had even attempted to become a more pacifist state. The problem with the Mandalorian civilization is complex, but I think boils down to the fact that they weren't given enough time for this transition to be completed. By the time the Galactic Empire became wary of their potential power and moved against them, they were split between competing ideologies and unable to present a unified defense. Now, it's true that against the power of the Empire, their world was probably doomed, but the potential at least existed for the Mandalorians to create a government in exile, scattered refugee colonies, and maybe a hidden fleet from the remnants of the military that might one day join the rebellion. Instead, the Mandalorian national identity was just too brittle to survive the destruction of their homeworld. In its place, the survivors have mainly retreated back into their old clans and old ideologies, but these clans are uniquely terrible at reasserting Mandalorian statehood.
I'm here to join you.
There's nothing left to join.
What of your plans to retake Mandalore?
When I returned without the Darksaber, my forces melted away.
We can see this particularly in the actions of the Tribe, a Mandalorian clan that routinely splinters itself and throws away opportunities to better the position of their people. Its members might call themselves Mandalorians, but they're really members of the Tribe first and rarely work with any other Mandalorian clans. Their whole creed seems to promote individualism above all, but this is strangling the potential of the larger whole. Most cultures, for example, would hold their coming-of-age ceremonies somewhere not too likely to be attacked by a giant sea monster. But no, not the Tribe, that wouldn't fit their code. Mandalorians are nearly extinct, and yet these people can't even induct a new member into their group without it turning into a net loss for their total population. Honoring some ancient practices is overriding every pragmatic concern. All they have to do is rent a community center on Navarro. Breaking with tradition might bring shame to the honored dead, but at least you won't be adding more Mandalorians to their ranks. The Mandalorians seem like a people that were given guns, jetpacks, and spaceships very early in their history, and rather than reforming their military and society to make the best use of these tools, just decided to jam them into whatever systems existed at the time. It's not enough to have these weapons if you don't know how to use them effectively. Sure, you could give uncontacted tribespeople in the Amazon M4A1 rifles and Apache helicopters, but they're not instantly going to turn into the US Army. Something like that, though, is what I'm pretty sure happened to the Mandalorians. And there's evidence of this in the aforementioned sea monster incident. A heavily armed group of Mandalorian warriors is attacked, so you would think they'd be pretty good at dealing with this, but they're not. Instead, in their response, we can see the total lack of any unifying structure or discipline. When confronted, every Mandalorian does their own thing. Some rush into a position to fire without checking to see if they're blocking the sightlines of those already firing. Orders are given, but not to anyone specifically. Who was supposed to get the young ones to the cave? Nobody said. Some jetpack onto the monster's back, further interfering with those trying to lay down fire from the ground. Mandalorians might be formidable warriors, but their creed is more concerned about individual actions than a collective response. Din Djarin didn't even radio ahead to say he was shooting torpedoes into the whole mess. He just did it. It's a miracle he didn't kill his own people. If the Mandalorians were truly concerned about being formidable warriors, their code would look less like this and more like this. Which leads me to my final point, which is the same as my first one. Over the course of this video, I've tried to argue that the proud warrior race is less and less successful as technology advances, and to survive it needs to evolve into something else. But what does the proud warrior race need to evolve into? Well, it's what I'm going to call the martial state. Both types of civilizations are what we might call warlike, but the martial state expresses this in a different way. Its tenets look like this. Immense influence placed within a military-industrial complex that can drastically affect public policy. Earlier traditions, practices, and ceremonies considered useful are adopted, exploited, and modified to support the aims of the state. A centralized government that exerts unrivaled authority across its constituent parts. Civilian institutions include paramilitary elements designed to ease the transition between peacetime and wartime. This kind of civilization has its own advantages and disadvantages, but a thorough investigation into the martial state will need to wait for a future video. Instead, let's quickly look at one example, the Turian hierarchy. The Turians are a near-perfect example of a civilization that has successfully completed the transition from proud warrior race to martial state. A period of public service is required of every citizen. Its government and entire society are organized under militaristic principles. Its military includes codes of honor, but they're centered around discipline rather than personal glory. And perhaps most importantly, though so much of their society is dedicated to warfare, it's not because they are actively seeking it out. Rather, they want to be prepared for war should it arrive unexpectedly. What the martial state has that the proud warrior race does not is a more thorough understanding of how wars are fought and won, an understanding that can evolve and be refined as technology advances. The proud warrior race, by contrast, is stuck in the past. It accepts any new ideas that it can fit into its society and rejects the ones that don't, even when they might be entirely beneficial. It is rigid, outdated, and doomed to fail. But that, of course, is just my opinion.
Your deaths will serve the glory of the Reich. Prepare to fire.
And even though I will challenge anyone who disagrees with me to ritual combat inside either the Arena of Truth or the Truthadome, depending on availability, I'd like to hear your thoughts. What civilizations come to mind when you first hear the term proud warrior race? Do you agree with my assessment? And has a giant alligator ever attacked your birthday party? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, this has been Incoming. In Incoming, the Templin Institute discusses the theories and ideas found across alternate worlds. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to join the Templin Institute, consider pledging to our Patreon page. Along with increased security access, you'll be able to vote in polls to determine future topics, get custom wallpaper every week, and receive some other exclusive rewards.